misty mountains lie the mines of Moria, the former dwarven kingdom of Khazad-dûm. After awakening at Balrog of Morgoth, the great subterranean city would lay silent and abandoned for 500 years, until the Dark Lord Sauron would begin to send his orcs there to occupy it and the passages through the misty mountains, waylaying anyone attempting to pass through. These creatures would eventually come to be known as the Moria Orcs, or Moria Goblins. 142 years before the finding of the One Ring by Bilbo Baggins, the dwarves would make an attempt to reclaim Moria during the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. At the climactic battle of Azanulbizar, the Orcs were defeated after their leader, Azog, would be slain and beheaded by Dain, son of Nain, and the battle would be won, but at a great loss. The Orcs would scatter, some falling back into Moria, whereas the dwarves, fearing Durin's bane, the Balrog, would dare not enter their old kingdom again. 2 centuries later, dwarves would once again enter Moria on an expedition led by Balin, a dwarf that had accompanied Thorin Oakenshield on the quest for Erebor. They would all eventually be slain by the Orcs, or other dark creatures. 22 years later, the Fellowship of the Ring would attempt to pass through Moria, discovering the remains of Balin's expedition and awakening the hordes of Orcs. They would battle their way through the Orcs, a cave troll, and eventually slaying the Balrog before escaping the East Gate and fleeing towards the woods of Lothlorien. The Orcs would pursue the Fellowship into the woods, but would be slain by the elves that awaited them. More would track the Fellowship south towards Amon-Hen, joining with Saruman's Uruk-hai, but would all be slain at the edge of Fangorn Forest by the Riders of Rohan. Sometime after the destruction of the One Ring and defeat of Sauron, well into the Fourth Age, Durin the Seventh would lead his dwarves back into Moria, at last retaking their kingdom. And if there were any remaining orcs at this time, it's safe to assume that they would be killed or driven out. That was a brief history of the Moria Orc, or the Moria Goblin. So now it's time to paint some. So these little guys were sculpted by Michael and Alan Perry and were released with the original run of Fellowship models back in 2001, early 2002. The first things first is we get them all cleaned up, primed in black. Next, with Vallejo Game Color Tinny Tin, I began to base coat all of the armor and chainmail on the model. Then I took a Citadel Contrast Black Legion to all of the armor parts, giving it a nice thick coating so that you barely get the tin color showing through the black. It's more of a slight undertone. As you can see, I've gotten a pen and blue tacked all the shields to it just to make them easy to paint, and I'm giving them the same treatment. Then once again, taking out the tin, I really lightly dry brushed over the chainmail, making sure not to get it on the actual plate armor. Next I went onto the fabric sections, beginning with a base coat of Vallejo model color flat red with just a little bit of Rhinox hide to give it that darker base coat. Just began applying that to all the little scraps of fabric around the model. Then moving up to the mid-tones, I just used flat red on its own. Then for the final highlights, mixed in a bit of white, not to make it too pink, and just picked out the final little edge highlights. For the skin, I mixed some Vallejo Game Color Desert Yellow with a little bit of Vallejo Model Color Military Green. And this just gives us that nice yellowy green tinted skin that the goblins have. Next up, I mixed some Vallejo Pale Sand into my flesh tones and started to highlight all the detailed area on the skin. And to finish off the highlighting, I just took some pale sand and picked out all the strongest features, making sure to get the edges of the nose, the lips, chin, and the tips of the ears. Now moving back onto the armor plating, I took a Vallejo gunmetal and started to just pick out random little chips and scratches where it's worked its way through the grimy layers of rust and grit, revealing the raw metal underneath. Now moving on to the leather and wooden parts of the goblin, such as the quiver, the bow, the spear shafts, etc. I started with a base coat of Citadel's Rhinoxide. And then I built up my highlights with Coat d'Arms Chestnut Brown, followed by Citadel Mournfang Brown for my final highlight. For the eyes, I started with a base color of Vallejo Filthy Brown, which is a nice dark yellowy color. Now I cheated a little bit here. I got a fine tip marker and just used it to dot out the pupils in the eyes of all the goblins. I just find it was a lot easier than trying to use a brush, and it still gives the desired effect. For the hair, I started to carefully highlight the strands with some Vallejo Dark Grey, followed by Vallejo Neutral Grey, and then a very light highlight of Vallejo Sky Grey. I did the same process for the fletching of the arrows. For any of the goblins showing their teeth, I got some Coat d'Arms bone and just carefully picked out their chompers. For the rust on the armor, I took some Vallejo Parasite Brown, just watered that down a little bit and lightly applied that randomly at spots across the armor. Now for the bases, I really wanted to simulate the look of Balin's tomb in the film, basing it off that really cool little diorama piece you got with the Battle Games in Middle-earth magazine set with all the scraps of paper and weapons and books on the ground. So I got some Geek Gaming Scenic Space Ready Volcanic Island, which was a nice little mixture of fine sand and slightly larger rocks, and glued that to the bases of all my models. And once the glue was dry, I then went and undercoated all the bases black. And next I got this is from a bit of plastic from a coffee cup lid, and started to draw out some designs for some axe blades. I then cut those out and just neaten them up a little bit, giving them a bit of an edge and refining the shape. And then I grabbed a toothpick, cut it down to size, and then I just basically shaved down the sides just to bring the diameter down and give it a rough look. I then glued all the axe heads to the shafts, as well as making a few other little bits of wooden debris. And then I started adding them to the bases of the goblins. I only did this for a few of them, but it just adds a bit of variation to the bases. Then just to really blend them in and make them look like they've been sitting on the ground for years, I just added a little bit of glue around the edges and a bit more basing material, just to look like they've been half buried under dust and debris over years and years. After undercoating all the new details with black, I then got Vallejo Dark Grey and base coated all over the bases. Then I took some Vallejo Neutral Grey and began dry brushing over the entirety of the base, followed by Vallejo Sky Grey for a final dry brush highlight. Next I started painting up all the weapons and debris scattered on the bases, so I started by painting the wood and metal details, and then I really weathered them down with some brown and black washes just to really give them that aged look like they've been sitting there for a while, and then gave them the same rust effect I put on the armor. Then taking out some Nuln Oil, I just put that on the bases around the items just to give them a bit of depth. Now to simulate the scraps of paper scattered across the ground, I took some regular A4 printer paper and just mixed that in with some brown wash, just really soaking it into it with a brush. And then using a pair of tweezers, I just picked up some pages, dipping them in a little bit of PVA glue before applying them randomly on the bases, using the tweezers just to form bent and tattered pages wherever I felt they were needed. Once the pages are dried in place, I just went over them again, just in areas with some brown and black washes, just to define more detail and add a bit more weathering. And then as the last touch for our bases, I just went over the pages with a fine tip marker, just scribbling out some little lines of text on each page. Now the final thing needed was just to glue these shields onto the models that had them, and our goblins were complete. So overall I'm pretty happy with how these turned out, and as you can see I decided to paint up a bunch of the plastic Moria Goblins as well, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what I paint next. Let me know what you guys think. Also let me know if you guys liked the little lore section at the start. I thought it'd be cool to start my painting videos off with a bit of backstory of the unit or the characters that I'm painting. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you guys next time.